Hey there. Today's podcast is all about Impressions to France with director Rick Harper. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 61 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. We've seen so many changes at Epcot over the years, and there's not that much left from the early days of the park. And that makes me appreciate even more the attractions that either were there at the start or at least have a similar feeling. You think about attractions like Living with the Land from the 90s, or Spaceship Earth, which has changed but is similar, or the American Adventure, which has only had very small updates. And I think the attraction that most embodies that feeling that is still playing is Impressions to France, which was an opening day attraction in 1982 and has been playing consistently for more than 35 years, which is crazy. And I think one of the reasons it's done so well is that it doesn't feel dated. It feels like a dream. You're going past these timeless places that are from various eras, but all feel classic. You're experiencing life in France. And there was real style and elegance to the creation of this film. And this made me so excited to have the chance to speak with Rick Harper, who directed Impressions to France. And what I learned after speaking with him is that his career is so much more than that film. He directed American Journeys, the Circle Vision film. He worked in the model shop at WED with so many legendary Imagineers at Disney. He also directed commercials and has filmed so many things over the years. And as I spoke to Rick while we were preparing to do the podcast, he also sent me a lot of interesting photos. Several are in the blog that accompanies this podcast. And seeing the behind-the-scenes photos of how they put Impressions to France together made me appreciate it even more. And that went through the roof after talking with Rick and learning how everything came together. So I can't wait for you to hear this conversation, which is up there definitely with my favorites I've done on the podcast. Before we get to Rick, though, I did want to mention a new way that you can support the podcast, which is through Patreon. You can become an official member of the Tomorrow Society and receive a few cool perks, including an additional monthly podcast, the Tomorrow Society Bulletin. You can go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society to learn more. But let's get to the main event. Here is Rick Harper. Okay, well, my guest today is a filmmaker who directed the classic Epcot attraction, Impressions to France, and the Circle Vision 360 film, American Journeys. He also worked in the model shop at Disney during the 1970s. It is Rick Harper. Rick, thank you so much for talking with me on the podcast.
Well, thank you for talking with me.
Oh, no problem. So before we dive into the films, let's talk a bit about your background. How did you eventually get interested and start working for Disney at WED?
Well, as far as getting interested, I was born in a magic year, 1950, when the culture for children was full of Disney. And so honestly, by the time I was 6 or 7, I was telling my parents I wanted to be a Disney artist. And a few years later, I told them I wanted to be a Disney animator. And a few years later after that, I told them I wanted to work at WED when I learned what that was. So the interest was very early. And now as far as getting hired there, early in high school, I started building architectural models mostly out of paper, using some other materials, but then they got more sophisticated and I began taking pictures of them with very theatrical lighting and whatnot. So I was kind of building a portfolio in the back of my mind, and eventually I actually sent one of these models to Roy Disney, Walt's brother, as a gift of appreciation for the wonderful creations that he and Walt brought to this world. And he sent a remarkable letter back that meant so much to me, and it gave me the confidence to keep pushing to get an interview at WED. And that eventually happened, and I was able to present these models to an amazing group of people who are now became Disney legends. John Hench, Claude Coates, Mark Davis, all these people, Herb Ryman, Yale Gracie. These are all people that I was able to present the work to. So eventually that led to me being hired in the model shop and working directly under Claude Coates.
You arrived at a time, too, where it was interesting, where, like you said, a lot of that group was still there. It was, coming after Walt, but still a lot of the old guard. What was it like? You mentioned working under Claude Coates. When you got to that model shop, working with Claude and some of the other group, what was it like being in that model shop at that time?
Well, it was heaven for me because I knew since I was about 10 or 12 years old, I began realizing who these people were. I had, Mickey Mouse Club books and things like this where a lot of these people had done illustrations, like Herb Ryman or Frank Armitage, Mark Davis. Claude Coates had done a few illustrations in these, Ken Anderson, Ward Kimball. I mean, all these magic names, and I admired their art greatly. Incidentally, I was drawing. I mean, it was. My earliest memories are drawing, and I've always drawn excessively and a bit obsessively. And so the designs and drawings fascinated me. And so by the time I was actually interviewed and working there, I was very familiar with who these people were, and I was in great admiration of their work. It turned out to also be wonderful people, just wonderful human beings, and Claude certainly meets that description. He was fantastic. I owe a bit of debt to Tony Baxter, whom I also met immediately there because he was still doing his work in the model shop there as well, although he had moved into design work. But like Claude, he preferred working in the model shop area. Claude had given Tony a lot of chances, and Tony performed so spectacularly. I think it's what in many ways gave Claude the idea to push me along toward design and then eventually to filmmaking.
Well, that's so interesting that you were there around that time because, Tony now is considered, he's like one of the Imagineering legends, but at the time was just fairly young guy just kind of trying to make his way. So
yes. And I mean, we hit it off. Tony and I hit it off immediately because we were in the younger generation, and we both grew up in complete awe of these people and of Disney. So Tony became really a confidant because there are always political issues and things that within a company, but also in terms of he was always terrific with guidance in design ideas as well. So, and he would look to me periodically for illustrations or storyboard ideas, and we would compare notes. So he's still a great friend, and that man is a genius, I can tell you that.
Oh, I've heard he's done some interviews on some other shows. There's one called The Season Pass where he did this like multi-part interviews that are fascinating. I mean, the guy, what he knows is just incredible. But I want to know for you, I know you worked on models for, the 70s. We had, the start of Walt Disney World and such. What were some attractions, that you were involved with in terms of the model shop?
Well, early on, the very first assignment I was given was they were building or wanted to clear an area in Frontierland in Disneyland for some arcades, but they wanted them completely redesigned and Disneyized. But these were old arcades that they'd gotten out of, bars and saloons. And, somebody had torn out all the, stuff in there except the mechanisms, which, by the way, it's interesting working on those because, let me back up a second. I was asked to basically, right off the bat, I was asked to take on a design challenge, was to take a theme that Tim Cook, I think, was the guy that was kind of supervising what I was doing initially. There were ideas for, this should be, maybe this will be about such and such and include these characters. So it was then up to me to just kind of convert all these weird mechanisms which were, stripped back to raw metal and mirrors and chain drives and things. And by the way, they're all upside down and sideways because as I'm sure you're aware, these old arcade systems worked off of a mirror that was at a 45-degree angle. So you're shooting into a mirror, really, with a light. And so I dove into that, and that's actually when Claude took notice of what I was doing, and he made some arrangement to kind of have me under his wing at that point. And very quickly he was pushing me along, and probably the earliest significant one was designing of the Space Mountain pre-show. He basically handed it over to me. He supervised with a wonderful guidance. And then by then John Hench had taken notice of me, and also Marty, and between the three of them, they said, well, let's send them to later on when it was to be installed, let's have Rick do the installation art direction as well. So that was a great experience. And when I came back, they booted me upstairs to a design office.
When you moved up to design, what was kind of that like? Like, what was your experience working in the design area?
That was so much fun because I was right next to I was in a corner office, and to the left of me was Albertino, and to the left of him was a wonderfully wacky, extremely talented young guy named Phil Mendez. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. Does that ring a bell at all?
No, it doesn't, but please tell me more.
Oh, he was really something. A great character designer. He was a guy from New York who was brought west. I think I have this right. I think Ken Anderson noticed his talent. I think Phil came out and did some in-betweening or something, but his real strength was character design. He was unbelievable at it. And so Ken Anderson actually had him living at Ken's house for a while, and then eventually Phil bounced over to WED, but he and Al were just hilarious together. They were like a storyboarding and gag team, and it was always, laughs constantly from those offices. To the other side of me, to my immediate right, was Exitencio, a wonderful man, and just a sweet individual, and he was a great mentor also. And next to him was Bill Justice, and you just don't get a kinder man than that. He was a great guy. Next to him, Rolly Crump, and then there was a conference room there that for a while was periodically would be occupied by John DeCure Sr., a mega talent. Is that a name familiar to you?
No, it's not actually.
Oh boy.
There's always more names for me to learn about.
Oh,
I know
always,
a lot.
Yes. Well, he came from the golden age of, great movie productions of the 50s and 60s. I think he did a few things in the 40s too, but a magnificent production designer who thought very big, and that's another story. He often went way outside the lines of practicality, and then, the rest of the design group would have to kind of pull these ideas into, something that was doable. But he was an amazing talent who wore a three-piece suit while painting oil paintings in that conference room. He was old school. I mean, if you've ever seen paintings of the 19th century masters painting, they're always in these three-piece suits while they're painting. That was John, Let's see. If I go around the room in my mind, there next is Frank Armitage, a brilliant guy, amazing person, and great artist, wonderful. These guys all came from the Disney culture of they were all like gentlemen and secure in their talent. There wasn't the insecure stuff that did appear. I did see some of that over at the studio and occasionally at WED, but this design group was a great group to work together. Next to him, was for a while Clem Hall, and then just around the corner was Herb Ryman. Of course, Orlando Ferrante was in an office that was very close by as well. Tim Delaney, another young talent, a great talent, and let me think, it goes on and on. At another point, I was in an office next to Sam McKim, a monster talent and very humble individual. And of course, Randy Bright was just on the other side of me. Great guy to work with. And George McGinnis was another one that I had great admiration for, and we spent many hours together. A lot of these people, these were not the ones I'm naming, these were not just, guys across the way or in the hall. These are people I really got to know closely, and some of them very closely, like Claude and Herb and John Hench, and of course Marty Sklar. Those four people, along with a couple others, Ward Kimball even, Albertino, but those four that I first mentioned, they were almost really like second fathers to me, because I was less than half their age, and I don't know if they were aware of it, but my father had died when I was in my mid-teens. I just sort of felt adopted by these people because they were always giving me chances and pushing me to higher levels they showed a great deal of confidence in me, which I greatly appreciated. And, oh gosh, it's hard for me to go. I see, I know that you're wanting individual experiences, but I'm kind of overwhelmed with the whole.
No, this is all great. So I'm curious, speaking of kind of getting put into different roles, when did you start getting interested in actually doing filmmaking? Because I know that you started doing short films and then commercials. When did that happen? How did that go?
Well, actually, in high school, simultaneous to doing the models I was building, I was making films in 16 millimeter. When my father died, he left behind a Bolex camera, a 16 millimeter camera, and I became quite interested in making films. So, oh gosh, during high school, I had made maybe 8 or 10 short films ranging in length from 3 minutes to maybe 10 minutes. They got a lot of notice locally because I became well known for filming all around town, and then having these little shows, presentations at high schools, and that eventually led to me receiving in the mail an invitation from Kodak for a contest they were doing for teenage. I think it was called the Kodak Teenage Movie Awards. So I entered 5 of my movies, and 4 of them won awards.
Wow.
So that turned into a very exciting trip to New York where, there were all these press people and all this stuff. So then my name started showing up in magazines, and I got invitations to other film festivals, and then I started winning awards overseas. So by the time I was hired at WED, even though I didn't show them any films, they didn't know, and I didn't think it was important at the time, but I had already gained about somewhere around 50 awards for these movies. Later on, I began showing them these films as I got to know people personally. I'd have little shows at WED, and then I was also doing films on the outside while I was working at WED, doing commercials and whatnot. It eventually led to Marty offering me one of the Epcot films, so he gave me my choice, actually. So I jumped at the chance at the French film.
Yeah, I can imagine that because, well, I mean, it's an amazing film. It's easy in hindsight to say, well, of course you chose that one. But why did you decide that was really attracted your interest more than the other ones?
Well, along with being a real Disney fan as a young person, I was extremely interested in 19th century art, particularly centered in France, because that was the epicenter of so many wonderful art movements at the time. And my mother had a really wonderful collection of books on that era. She was an artist and musician, as was her grandmother, and all of my mother's sisters were. So there was a lot of interest, and they were all really interested in that era. So there was a lot of influence from my mother in my interest in that. So, and also French music. My mother was very cultured, and she I grew up in San Jose. She would take me out of school. I mean, this is in grade school. Take me out of school, show up and say, I'm going to take Rick for the day. And we'd go up to San Francisco to a symphonic concert. And generally speaking, it was French, 19th century music. And so really when I've been so interested in the French culture, yet I had never been to France. So when the opportunity came up to do that film, I really jumped at it.
The interesting thing about the French film, or Impressions to France, is that it feels so different than the other ones, especially that were there originally in China and in Canada. Mm-hmm. And not just because of the format, but like you said, with the music, I feel like it's almost like you've entered this dream where you're just floating around France and such with the music. Was it hard at all to get Disney to sign off on kind of this different approach where there wasn't really there's a narrator, but there's not really a narrator guiding you through it? Was that a difficult challenge?
That is a very perceptive question because, yes, the whole approach was different. I mean, during storyboarding and during very early on, I was assembling, long before there was a storyboard, I was assembling the music and wanted to do exactly what you described, kind of a dreamlike journey, a romanticized journey. And I wanted to keep, I just didn't want a lot of factoids. I didn't want to left brain the thing. I wanted it to be a right brain experience and more of an emotional experience. And I, on my little quarter-inch reel-to-reel Sony recorder at home, I recorded all this stuff and then took it into the sound department and did some crossfades here and there. And then, of course, those were the days where I would just take, you just physically cut the tape and put the recording tape, and you just tape things together. I mean, much like, the Beatles did later on their Sgt. Pepper recordings, they had to do that. But anyway, so I had this little demo tape and presented it to Randy Bright. He was behind it early on. He went, "This is cool," because he liked the fact that it was different. I mean, the music, for someone like me anyway, the music really sells a lot, and I like to call it the secret weapon in a film. Then from there it was convincing Marty, which took a little longer, and John eventually got on board with it. There were some more severe criticisms from the studio, but eventually, by basically starting by just going through a bunch of books on France and cutting out images and sticking them on the wall and rearranging them here and there, and then trying to figure out where these places were and, what the history was and whatnot, and coming up with something that felt like you were just being drawn to the film. An artist friend of mine way back in high school had said something really interesting to me that stuck with me while working on the storyboard for this. She said, certain art, whether it's music, movies, writing, or paintings, certain art will draw you in, and other art will push you around. I like the type of art that draws you in, and that was the goal on that film.
Yeah, I mean, you just think about it. The other films are great, but I think there's something to be said that Impressions to France has not been updated. They haven't come up with they haven't done a new version. And I mean, just from the very beginning, you have that flute that shows up, and then there's the Normandy cliffs. And right off the bat, I mean, I can think about, I don't watch this film all the time. I don't live in Florida, but I can still picture certain parts of the movie, and I'm picturing them with the music. And I think that, like you said, it's like the secret weapon to it. So while you were shooting, so you mentioned you had these cassette tapes, and I know you've let me know that you had like a little cassette recorder that you took on location. So how tricky was that to, while you're shooting, and then you have this music that you're trying to kind of get a gauge on how it would work? Was that a real challenge to do?
Well, everything was a challenge with that camera system. Oh my gosh. The thing weighed 550 pounds loaded with, these old Mitchell cameras on there. And by the way, the camera, a full load of film would only shoot a little less than 4 minutes. So, and then reloading the system took at least a half hour if the other magazines had already been loaded. As far as the music goes, yes, I took a cassette player with me. And one thing that was just really a side benefit of doing that was I would play the music for the crew. And this was a French crew, and believe me, I came to really love the French people because they have art flowing in their veins. I mean, they just have a rich love for art, and the crew members were just, they loved the idea of the film. I took them through a storyboard and played the music and whatnot early on, and they really got on board with it. So then playing the cassette with certain scenes like the tilt up of the Eiffel Tower there, it became really important because the timing on that in particular was important with the way the music flowed. Other scenes involved some important timing, like some of the aerials did and whatnot. So in those cases, the helicopter makes a heck of a racket. It was just a matter of timing the shot and working that out with the pilot.
Yeah, because there's so many scenes where, whether it's a hot air balloon or whether you're flying towards, a castle or whatnot,
Yeah.
where the music does seem to fit right with it. And some of those scenes are only, what ends up in the finished film, I know you probably shot a little more, or 30 seconds or something. So the timing is crucial. So
Yes.
I'm impressed you were able to do that. So tell me a little more. You mentioned the camera. So how you sent me some pictures of the helicopter and the camera, and how do you wield? It's not like now, we have these image of either if there's a camera, it's something you could walk around with, or there's phones or digital cameras. How do you wield that and actually perform as a director when you're making a film?
Well, it involves a lot of gymnastics, that's for sure, because you got to climb all over. Oh, first of all, the camera, you can only see one frame at a time in the viewing. You may have noticed in some of those pictures I'm looking through an eyepiece, low on the camera system. And that one eyepiece covered just the range for one view. And, the mirrors are broken up, so, are set at different angles on that thing. So, and plus, because you're looking through a mirror, you're looking at the image backwards. So, lining up a shot was really complicated because you didn't want, and I always try to include some movement in the shot. There are very few shots in that film that don't have the camera moving. When the camera is moving, you run into the danger of something winding up along the dividing lines that is awkward visually. For example, somebody standing there or, something that has lettering on it, and instead of spelling, the right word, it spells a shorter word because it's on this dividing line, and things like that, or even anything that may look strange divided because it didn't come to a perfect match on that. So that was a big issue. It took a long time to set these things up, and it was... And very often there were, two camera assistants were frantically reloading. Joe and I were trying to, Joe Nash, the camera assistant, who was fantastic, totally reliable, knew every single thing about that camera as an engineer. He's also an engineer, so, and wonderfully supportive. He was always looking over the camera, and he was very possessive of it. He finally allowed me to set some of the f-stops and to move the camera with him and, mess around with it because we had to rely on each other under the time crunches. Another thing was we often were shooting, because shooting with film in those days, we were shooting with a speed of 25 on a lot of this, and that translates into having to shoot in very, very bright light. But I always wanted things at the beginning of the day or end of the day or in a twilight hour where there was just more of a warmth or a twilight effect to bring more of a romantic, feel to the imagery. So we were very familiar with, frantically moving to capture these times right.
Well, that's interesting because I think of one of those really early scenes when you're kind of moving along the waterway, and it does feel like it's like the very start of the day. And if that was bright and it seemed like it was noon, it would not have that same effect. So I hadn't even considered that, how not only do you have to shoot with this massive camera and the mirror thing, as not being a filmmaker, my brain can barely process how you even did that backwards. So I'm really impressed by that, but it's a testament to how well everything was put together that happened. So you mentioned getting out the book and looking at the places. I'm curious because I feel like you could find 100 places in Paris, and that's one of the few places in France I've been. But how did you narrow down beyond the Eiffel Tower and Versailles and all that? How did you really narrow down the places you decided to film at?
Had to go there physically and just really examine the situation there because with this camera shoots basically a 200-degree panorama, so it became important to establish, okay, can we actually shoot here and not have a nuclear power plant on the shot somewhere?
Yeah.
or some ugly wires or whatever. And in some cases we had situations like that found, some creative solutions to those problems. But getting out and really seeing the different areas of France, it really helped a lot and to narrow it down quite a bit. And the shot list became pretty darn specific. There are a few grab shots in the film, believe it or not, with that camera, because I don't like sitting around waiting for, weather to change or the wind to come down or whatever. And so I would often just create a shot where we were stuck. And some of those wound up being used in the film. The older couple on the top of those cliffs at Etretat, that was a grab shot done in a light rain when the crew was hanging out in a local tavern, and I'm going, dang, I want to shoot something. But then the idea came to me to tag that on to the end of the wedding sequence, and I went running down into the village and, got everybody to come up on the hill, and we threw that shot together. And the old couple was a couple that was in the tavern with the crew. So, you mentioned the shot of the guy chopping wood. That was another one of those things. We're sitting around waiting for someone to deliver the bicycles for that bicycle shot, and they were late. I'm going, dang, and I wandered off into the local piece of property across the street and went, geez, this would make a wonderful shot. So the guy chopping the wood is our lead crewman, Renee Strasser, and that wound up in the film. There are a couple others like that.
That's so interesting, because what gets me also about this is all the little scenes like that. Like, yes, we have the big majestic moments, but the guy chopping wood or the wedding or the village, and that interests me. How much was that on your mind, though, when you were before you really dove in, of kind of capturing these little moments within all the big grand monuments and stuff?
Very much on my mind, and that's why I was always on the lookout for an opportunity to grab something like that. The wedding was very much planned and took a lot of planning, and the filming of it, I think you can tell from seeing the stills, there was a heck of a lot involved with that as well. But we really wanted to get the intimacy along with the grandeur, definitely. And going there and meeting, in a lot of the cases during the scout, meeting some of the local mayors and whatnot, and getting to know some of the villagers where we want. In some cases, these places we wanted to film were owned by locals, and getting to know them and what. The wedding scene, for example, where where it's like the reception at the end, where they're in Brittany and it's at night and there's this traditional dance going on there. Scouted a lot for a place where that could be done. Well, driving around looking at farms down these little dirt roads, and we run into this one. I'm going, okay, I think this will work. We knock on the door. A guy comes out. I'm having to work through the translators, and I noticed that he was wearing, I swear this is true, I have pictures of this, I should send them to you. As I'm talking to him, I look down and I see that he's wearing wooden shoes with straw in them instead of socks. Now, this is like classic out of a 19th century painting, and so I quietly took my camera, and so kind of while talking to him, I aimed it down at his feet and shot a picture because I just had. Anyway, so we got to know and thought, gee, we really want to get the feeling, the rural, Parisians are very different. It would be, if we were doing a film about France and included only Parisians, it would be like only including, a big metropolitan area and not getting into the rural areas.
Right, and then it wouldn't really get what France is. I mean, Paris is a big part of it, but it's one little part. You mentioned the bike riding scene, which is still one of my favorite scenes, where basically you get this feeling, especially when you're seeing it on the big screen, that they're like chasing you down and somehow you're riding backwards.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how did you film that? I mean, obviously you weren't on a bike, you were on some other vehicle, but how did that all come together?
Well, that was basically, the camera was, in essence, on the back of a pickup truck. And much like, I think I included a shot there where we were, where I'm kind of crouching down while we're filming the French Republican Guard there on horseback. I don't know if you saw that image. It's in there somewhere. But yeah. It's the same kind of thing. It was just on the back of that truck, and we told them, get as close as you can, and the driver was very astute, and by the way, all those bicyclists are just our crew members, so it gave them a chance to be on the screen.
Oh, you're just destroying my thoughts of this. That I thought you got some French locals who happen to be riding. No, I'm kidding.
Well, really, they are. in a way, because they're all French, with one exception. Karis Horton, who is one of the bicyclists, and she nearly goes off the road there at one point, but she was an American who married the Frenchman Antoine Campan, who was a brilliant production manager. The two of them were absolutely brilliant, amazing, with different talents, but as they worked together incredibly. And it was fun to get them all on there and try to catch up with us.
Yeah, that's a really fun scene, and it brings a lot of life to the movie. So on a completely different level, you mentioned the Eiffel Tower. So yes. I have to ask you about that shot, because the feeling of scale when you're having the Eiffel Tower is in person, as you know, seems so much larger than it does in pictures and such, but I think you guys do a good job of capturing it. But tell me about that shot where basically, I don't know if I assume you're in the elevator, like you're basically going up the side there. To put that on the 3 screens, it seems mind-boggling.
Well, first of all, the tilt-up shot was done from a crane that was about, it was the same crane we used for the balloon liftoff scene, which, by the way, might be an interesting scene to discuss as well. But the crane was probably up, I would say, I'm trying to remember here, it was probably up about maybe 150 feet in the air for that tilt-up shot. It had to be positioned exactly so that when I tilted the camera up, and I had to physically do that. There was no mechanism for that. I had to just tilt it by way of a brilliant device, cradle actually, that Don Iwerks came up with, another man who was wonderfully supportive on this project, because I wanted to do a lot of crazy things, and he said, yeah, and he'd figure something out. That, it was important to start at the level, so-called level, and then tilt up and then have it framed to get that massive nature of it across all those screens. And then dissolving to the shots where we were actually on top of the Eiffel Tower elevator, one of them. It was pretty harrowing because it gets a bit technical and long, so I can't quite go into all of it, but the first testing we did nearly ended in a real calamity where there's a huge mechanism that, the Eiffel Tower has tilted legs, but that changes. It's tilted maybe at 60 degrees at the beginning, and then it goes gradually into vertical. That's a complex mechanism that involves these huge moving parts, and some of those moving parts almost swept us and the camera right off the top of the roof while we were trying to make radio contact with the engineer down in the basement running the whole thing. It was pretty scary.
Oh my gosh.
But we finally got all those bugs worked out and got the shots that we wanted.
Well, that's great, because the shot is amazing. But yeah, that's the thing that, you had sent over the images, and a lot of the images, whether it's from the car race or everything, you're always kind of hanging out in some weird spot or on top of something. And I'm like, were there regulations at this point? Because it leads, I think a lot of that what leads to the film being so good, but it's so interesting because I just don't, when you watch the movie, you have no concept of how that's going. And you mentioned the balloon scene, which I love. Tell me a little bit about that, how that came together.
Well, the serenity of that scene took a lot of utter chaos to achieve it. Just how can I do this briefly? The first of all, getting there's so many variables and technical issues. The camera, the crane, getting us a crane that would move smoothly. I mean, this was a construction crane, and I tested I don't know how many dozen cranes in Paris to see which ones would be capable of moving smoothly, and there was this one that was working pretty well, so we wound up using that whenever we used a crane. But bringing that out to the Loire Valley in front of the castle and getting the thing to function right was in itself a matter of hours to get that right. Then the weather was changing constantly, of course, that was another thing. But the balloons, I placed them all in different areas, and working very closely with the primary balloon pilot and the owner, actually, of that balloon company, whose name was Buddy Bombard. He, by the way, Colin Campbell introduced me to him, and suggested I look into working with this guy, so I owe a debt to Colin about that. They had to, in order to set up the rehearsal, and of course there's all the, there's this table and all these people and food and, costumes and all that stuff going on, and in the midst of everything else. But the balloons themselves had to be kept inflated just enough to keep them manageable on the ground, because as the wind would change a little bit, I had to have them, I'd say, hey, we got to walk this one over here a little bit so that by the time it gets up in the air a little bit, it isn't, blowing straight into the camera and knocking us over or whatever the conditions were. And then occasionally as a gust of wind came along, one or two of the balloons would kind of collapse. I don't know if you can picture this, but it's like, they're made of this flimsy material and they just sort of collapse. And so that became chaotic, and some of the pilots grew a little tired of what was going on, and the crew kept the vision, and we got through the first day of setup and rehearsal, and then it was a matter of, on the second day, trying to nail a take that would work. And we had to do a few takes, and then keep in mind that changing the camera load, we only got 4 minutes, which meant technically we only got, at best, 2 takes out of each load. And then when the balloons take off, they have to be brought back again in vans, and they have to be deflated, brought back in vans, reinflated, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, we're getting the camera ready for another round. So day 2 was a matter of shooting a number of takes. Oh, the weather was changing constantly. Clouds were coming in. I gotta have sun for this. And it's got to be either early sun or late sun. So we started setting up in the dark, missed the early due to either cloudy weather or balloons collapsing on each other or something. And finally, at the end of the second day, the magic came together and we got that shot. And it was such a celebratory time for everybody, believe me.
So that raises an interesting question. So when you're doing all of this and you're trying to get the right shot, when are you able to actually, at the time, and this is probably my lack of understanding about that time period and how filmmaking work, when are you actually able to go back and look at what you shot that day? I mean, do you do that every night, or when are you able to see if you got it?
Oh gosh, these are great questions. That was certainly a thorn in our flesh all the time, because the different loads of film had to be matched in the old days of film. If you wanted, film was processed in labs where every batch was a little different. Every chemical batch was a little different. And so you couldn't rely on any 2 reels looking quite the same in terms of the color sense about them. This was just a something that people had to accept about movie making. And then later on, you would do what was called color timing, where in the lab, before the negative was made, you would make an inner negative by putting different filters in front of the different shots to get back to the look that you thought you were getting when you shot. Well, when you have 5 cameras that have to match, it becomes extremely important that they're all run through the same chemical batches all the way through the process. So the one lab that would take this on was Technicolor in Hollywood, and we knew we could trust them. They had a great relationship with Disney. So all of this footage had to be sent back to California, processed, and then viewed at the studio. They could only view 3 screens at a time, so it had to be viewed, there are 5 cameras, so it had to be viewed, the 3 left ones, the middle 3, and the right 3 ones, to make sure things were matched. I had an assistant at my office that I trusted completely for his very sharp eye, and he would go to the studio and look at the stuff and then call me right away. Yeah, you got this, or oh boy, you got a problem here, or there's scratches on this reel. What are we going to do about that? Or there's vibration in this helicopter shot. You got to redo that. We had that happen a couple of times. In 2 cases, I had to fly back to California to kind of really brainstorm, what I was going to do about this.
Wow. All of that just makes the finished film even more impressive to me. The fact that, because I'm sure I knew that you didn't, it's not like you have like now where they have the digital monitors and stuff, but I didn't realize like in and the fact that you didn't, obviously Epcot's theater was not ready. You didn't even have there wasn't even a 5-screen place to watch it. That's crazy.
Eventually there was. And again, thanks to Don Iwerks, eventually, the filming took place across, oh golly, probably 9 months. And that doesn't mean we were filming for 9 months. It meant there were breaks in between where we had to, line up other things. And in some cases, I had to scout for alternative things or whatnot, and fly back to California, sort out stuff with production, and budgetary issues I'd sort out with Bob Jabot. So there were maybe four, I think there were 4 different shooting, maybe 5 anyway, across that 9-month period, with breaks in between. So that gave me a chance to, for the latter part of that, Don, I think for the last, couple of shooting periods, I was able to go back and actually see the 5-screen results, and that was a great relief to be able to see them all at once. During those periods also, I would work out rough edits of some of the material to see how it was coming together.
Yeah, that had to be really helpful, I'm sure, to get to actually be able to edit it that way and start to head in that direction. I wanted to circle back to the music real quick, though, because yes. I know that, Buddy Baker was involved, who's a well-known Disney figure, and I know more involved with the arranging, not with the choosing, but then creating some additional music. So what was it like to work with Buddy, and how did that work out?
Well, it was another dream come true because, knowing his deep history and his great talent, he was assigned to basically do music for Epcot. And so when that assignment was announced, I approached him right away and laid out what it was I wanted to do. I had not met him before this time, and I didn't know what to expect. I thought, oh man, because, film composers really don't like, in general, they don't like a temp track being thrown at them and say, match this, But I wasn't asking him to match it. I was asking him to use it. And by that time, I had, 80-85% of the film, music kind of worked out. And he listened to it, and he said to me, well, such a relief. He said, well, I happen to love this music, and you've done me a great favor, Rick. He said, I'm so up to my ears. And he said, I think this is wonderful, so we'll work it out. And there were areas on the tape I played from where there were indications for needs of transitions. In a couple of cases, key changes were needed to be done, and I had done edits on some of the music that actually rather confounded the arranger, and Buddy, anyway, they worked all that out, and it got, Buddy just did a wonderful job of creating the transitional music and carrying the feel. He really had a heart for this film, and he had a heart for the music, and it really came through. And it came through also working with him under very stressful conditions, recording at Abbey Road Studios. We happened to record on the day of the worst snowstorm in, 100 years in London.
Wow.
And all the musicians had horrifying, exciting stories about how they showed up. But the recording session started, I forget how many hours late, but really late. And there were technical issues due to the freezing weather as well, in terms of the studio, electricity and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty wild. But Buddy was just a total pro and a gentleman, delightful person, great sense of humor, and total joy to work with.
Well, that's great to hear. So, yeah, you mentioned Abbey Road, and you recording with an orchestra there.
Yeah.
So, what was that experience like?
Oh, well. I've recorded a few times with orchestras, and let me tell you, that's a thrill and a half. That's a thrill, because on the screen, of course, in this case, we were only projecting the middle screen for Buddy to kind of keep in his head while conducting. But when you record the music, it's magic. It really, really is. It was a thrill and a half. It was also very thrilling trying to get home because the airport was completely crammed with people. The airport had been shut down, and it's a crazy story. But anyway, we did it. And Glenn Barker, by the way, was there, and a magnificent he's another guy that never loses his cool. He's just has this dry wit about him, very sharp mind, and he's the guy who spearheaded the idea of recording digitally, which presented also a number of challenges at the time because we were working with a prototype machine that had been flown in from Japan, There were only 2 in the world at that time. Sony had come up with this digital thing. There was one in LA and one in Japan. I think we got the one from Japan. Even the Abbey Road studio guys were going, wait a second, what are we dealing with here? So there was a learning. This whole film involved quite a learning curve because every step of the way we were trying to kind of push the envelope on the technical stuff.
Well, I think that shows, though, because it doesn't feel like a movie like that was shot in the early 80s, basically late 70s, early 80s. It's basically still holds up really well, and that's kind of my overall, I guess I'd say, last question about Impressions to France is, people were really concerned. Disney recently announced they're going to do this Ratatouille ride there, and everyone's like, oh no, they're going to close Impressions to France, especially big fans, and they're not. And which surprised me actually pleasantly. So just because of kind of trends in the industry. So why do you think it's held up so well where even Disney would decide, hey, we want to keep this? Like, what is it about it that makes it so timeless for you?
Well, it's funny. The goal at the time was to try to keep this as undated as possible with the visuals as well. And to achieve that, there were, different tricks used. I mean, on the Champs-Élysées, for example, when we're driving down toward the Arc de Triomphe there in Paris, they shot it in twilight, and to kind of help obscure the fact that, these cars are eventually going to look really old someday. And, anyone who's into cars is going to notice right away. But the hope was, I remember telling Randy, I'm really, really wanting this to play for a decade and possibly more, and take that approach to it. So it's just, really, really fun that it's managed to last as long as it has. As far as your other part of that question, though, people call me because I keep in touch with people at WED and whatnot, and I've gotten some calls, interesting calls where, people tell me, hey, there's a rebel group here that's, trying to keep the French film. And I go, well, that's cool, So apparently there's kind of a little uprising among certain Imagineers along the way that have kind of taken the issue upstairs. So guess it's. I thought it'd be gone long ago, but I'm happy that it's stuck around. It's an interesting thing, though. I heard the other day that I think they came up with a really smart idea. They want to get some dual use out of that theater,
right?
And I think there was somebody sent me an article about they're going to do some kind of a Beauty and the Beast music stage presentation of some kind.
Yeah, I think it's like a sing-along, which I'm not sure I understand. Yeah, but I think, Don Hahn, who's is supposed to be involved with it, so it can't just be like putting the movie on the screen. But I hope that they're able to do it, like you said, as a dual use, that the warning bells go off in my head that go, what if this is not more popular because it's better, but it's Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
So I get a little nervous and I'm thinking, okay, but I have to understand things do change at theme parks. And like you mentioned, I mean, do you think about it? The film in Canada, they redid with Martin Short, and now they're going to redo again. The film in China was redone. They're going to redo it again. The fact that Impressions to France is still there as an opening day attraction, there's not much left from opening day at Epcot. It's incredible.
Well, it's certainly been fun to see that it lasts as long as it did. And as far as the sing-along, I think it's a good idea. And I mean, see, I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, and I know that she would go nuts for the Beauty and the Beast sing-along. I have no doubt about that. And it'll probably be a great draw. They're going to do, I guess the idea is to alternate.
Right.
It may eventually turn into, 2 or 3 of the Beauty and the Beast shows, to one of the French film thing. But, all things must pass, as they say. So it'll eventually be gone.
If it's a way to keep the Impressions of France, and if they're only going to show it 3 or 4 times a day, or whatever, and it stays, okay, that I'm okay with that. So I wanted to ask you about a few other things you worked on here. So we'll get to American Journeys in a minute, but I have to ask you, You shot this commercial of Space Mountain, and you sent me this picture, which is basically you sitting on Space Mountain holding a handheld camera, with this crazy face on it, and I don't understand it all. So explain this commercial to me.
Okay, that is a gag shot. It's a total gag shot. And by the way, that's my wife sitting next to me there.
Oh wow!
And first of all, the commercial was done. I mean, this is so crazy. It was done on the sly. I was still working at WED and doing, film projects and including commercials and some, like promotional films and things, educational films on the outside. Well, the opportunity came along to do a Space Mountain commercial. And this is unbeknownst to WED. I went, okay, I'll do that. And really wanted to do it. So that film was shot that commercial was shot over a long weekend down at Disneyland using the loading area or the exit area, I think it was, at the time that was, partly still under construction. And so I had to shoot from 8 at night to 6 in the morning. The model of Space Mountain, we used that. That was down there also in a warehouse, and lit that model and used that as part of the opening of the sequence. And then there was an effect shot in it that was shot in a warehouse with one of the cars on a teeter-totter. I would dolly past the arrangement, this mechanical arrangement with the vehicle on it, as it was being tilted by a crew member dressed in black against a black background. We had black duvetine all over the place, and then the people in the actors were supposed to go as the thing appeared to be moving along and tilting and going down. So then eventually we, with an optical printer, put a starfield behind all of this. Well, just as a gag shot. And again, we were shooting all this stuff in the middle of the night because we didn't want any light leaks in this warehouse, from daylight and whatnot. So at the end of that shooting, we were all kind of bonkers and just did that gag shot.
Well, that makes more sense because I was like,
nothing was shot handheld.
Yeah, you didn't ride it and shoot it that way. Well, it's funny because you mentioned kind of the manual way you had to kind of do some workarounds. I remember, I'm not sure they're still there now, but the safety videos that they have even at Disney World that don't look like, they probably were shot in a similar way, even because they look very fake, like they were shot in front of an effect screen or something.
Yeah.
So because they rarely, I think, for something, even a commercial, they don't just put a camera on it and show the whole ride or something.
Yeah. Well, today it's more likely you can do it with, it's amazing what you could do. And again, with virtually no light and no weight to the camera and no limit to how long you can shoot. It's just, it's a different world. And this stuff was, it was very bulky, crazy stuff.
All right. Well, I want to ask you about one other thing
yes.
having to do with Disneyland. And it looks like you also shot footage for the speed tunnel, which is unfortunately Disneyland doesn't have their people mover operating anymore. But when they have the speed tunnel, and I love, just to say, speed tunnels in general, which used to be they were in Epcot and World of Motion. They had them in, if you had Wings, though I know it's still Buzz Lightyear, but they were common. So how do you shoot something like that? It looked like you were out in the desert, and how did that go?
That was fun, and that was the first, after making the Space Mountain commercial, if I remember right. I showed the Space Mountain commercial at WED, and so really quickly after that, Claude and Marty said, heck, let's have him shoot this speed tunnel thing. And so that was a wonderful opportunity because Art Cruikshank was part of that, and he's a man I had greatly admired for his work as a special effects pioneer over the 20th century, but then Disney snagged him and brought him over to Disney. So he was the director of photography on that, and so I did the directing, and it was just, we put two VistaVision cameras on different vehicles, one aimed forward and one aimed backwards, and then shot all these crazy things of moving quickly by other things coming toward us. In one case, it was the Everglade boats, with those huge propellers on the back, and actually we had a really serious accident with one of those. That's a funny story, actually. the footage came out really well. Art and I had a wonderful time together. I met Joe Nash for the first time, the camera assistant that would become my rock for making sure the equipment was always working on the later Circle Vision films. So I met a lot of wonderful people on that. And it was right after that Ron Miller actually, along with Art Cruikshank, offered me the job to take over Art Vitarelli's job because Art was going to retire soon. And Art was the second unit director for the studio for the feature films. And I turned down Ron, and he got really upset with me. And then he later, calmed down and said, well, actually, I respect your decision. So that eventually led. I kept in touch with Ron and showed him the things I was working on. By then, I was doing a lot of things on the outside, and I just wanted to keep doing that. So eventually, that led to the French film.
Yeah, I kind of circled back and then in time before the film, but that's okay. So that's an interesting story. So you mentioned the Circle Vision film, and I wanted to make sure I mentioned American Journeys. And I'll admit, I know that I saw American Journeys, at Disney World or Disneyland as a kid, and I've watched the YouTube videos, though, because it's no longer playing, are not like seeing Impressions of France. So they're a little hard to see, but just, that was a Circle Vision film, and, very different, shot, after Impressions of France. So tell me a little bit about shooting that and some of the differences with having to actually do the full Circle Vision.
Well, it was tricky because on the French film, we were continually raising the bar on what you could do with this camera. And part of the ability to do that, and part of the rationale when I was trying to sell the idea of doing a 5-screen film instead of a Circle Vision film, was part of the rationale was, well, with those 4-back cameras missing, we can use a crane. We can mount on different types of vehicles. We can achieve things that have never been achieved with these Circle Vision cameras. I mean, previous to that, the cameras were shot primarily from a DC, aerials were done from a DC-3 plane that was flying, 15 miles above the Earth, and you couldn't get close to anything. And on the ground, things were shot usually from a public street with the camera mounted on top of a station wagon. So I really wanted to get away from that and get more intimate with things. So by doing that on the French film, it was expected now on American Journeys, but it got a lot more complicated with those 4 additional cameras on the back. So that was a challenge, but it was a fun challenge because I had to come up with a lot of creative solutions for that to try to match that level of technical achievement.
Are you saying you spent more time kind of like standing on weird vehicles and hanging out of things?
Definitely. In fact, I learned to sit on top of the camera. Joe devised a little platform up there that I could sit on so I could see what was going on and, look all around. And very often, because you have to clear everything out of the way. And of course, shooting in public, people don't realize, for example, in the French film, anything that involved people had to be completely staged from the ground up. I mean, the market scene, for example, we had to take over a little town completely. And that's the way it was in the American Journeys film as well. Otherwise, you got people staring at the camera and that kind of stuff.
Right. Because you think about now, the newest Soren film, they use some computer generated imagery, but also they can just digitally take people out. They don't have to you couldn't do that back then. So you were kind of I wouldn't say stuck, but you had to almost have a controlled environment.
Oh, completely. Yes, absolutely. That was, and in some places, like the fireworks at the end, for example, on the Statue of Liberty island there, we had to completely take over that island and take over we had to get the local, air controllers and the aviation authorities to agree to not have anything fly in that area for about a 4-minute period while we were trying to shoot, which was right at that key moment at the twilight where the fireworks would show up really beautifully against the deep blue sky. And we had to control the harbor traffic. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like, the filming part is like, that's the fun part, but all the logistics and preparation is like 95% of it or something.
Well, this is where I have to really laud it Karis Horton and her husband, Antoine Compton. They were amazing. I had to lobby heavily to bring them over from France to be the production managers on the American Journeys film, because I thought, this is, these people are amazing, and they understand the issues with this camera system when we push the envelope on it, and eventually the studio bought into that idea. It was a little tricky, getting around the union issues and whatnot, but I was awfully glad to have them along, because they were amazing at working out that kind of stuff, the logistics like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like that's so important to making a great film, and Impressions of France is gorgeous, but all the legwork you had to do, I'm sure, is the only way it could be that way.
Yeah.
So great. Well, this has been amazing talking with you. So I just have one last question. I'm just curious, I believe you retired from doing films officially, but I know you still do some artwork. So how do you spend your time now?
Well, I'm definitely a family man, and moving to Carmel, California in the early 90s, I continue to do a lot of film projects. I did some things for big screen films for theme parks and attractions in Taiwan and in Japan, and I also did 3D films and motion seat 3D films, and as well as following my love of art history, got involved doing special films for the National Gallery of Art. I did 3 films for them and other museum films. So very busy. And then I reached a point where I went, you know what, I'm ready to just go paint and be with my family. So I did that in 1992. I moved up here, and it's a good life, believe me.
Yeah, it sounds good. It's very cold here today in Missouri, so I'm a little jealous of that life.
Oh yeah, I heard there's getting some of that cold going on there.
Well, great. I love Impressions to France, and a lot of your other stories and work. I mean, it sounds like you had just an amazing experience working at WED and at Disney, and I really appreciate the time. It's been amazing to talk with you, Rick.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your interest very much, and I'm a bit of a recluse when it comes to interviews. So your very kind personality kind of won me over to get pulled into this. So thank you.
Well, great. I'm glad it worked out. It was so much fun.
And if you're ever out our way, please don't hesitate to contact. We'd like to show you some beautiful sights out here.
Oh, I will definitely do so. Don't worry about that. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Well, that was amazing to talk to Rick. And like we discussed near the end of the podcast, if you're in Epcot, go see Impressions to France. 1, because you never know how long it'll be there. And 2, because we want people to know that there are lots of fans that love this film. And if you like this podcast, I also wrote a blog as a tribute to Impressions to France. And you can find that at tomorrowsociety.com or click on the link in the show notes page. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc, or Facebook, Instagram, or Pinterest at Tomorrow Society. And don't forget to go to patreon.com/tomorrowsociety to learn about how to become an official member of the Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Have a wonderful holidays and a great New Year's. I'll be back in 2019 with a bunch of new shows. Thanks so much for the support throughout the year, and I will talk to you again very soon.